This is the Retirement Lifestyle Advocates radio program. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Glad you decided to listen in today. Hey, joining me on today's program is economist John Williams. John is the host of the website shadowstats.com, and John calculates economic data using the methods that were once used. It's probably no secret to many listeners that the way the inflation rate is calculated has changed over the years to make the reported numbers look more favorable. John uses the old methods to calculate the inflation rate. He's going to join me in segments 2 and 3 of today's program and tell us by his calculations what the actual inflation rate is and get his take on what the ultimate inflation forecast is. I know you're going to appreciate my conversation with John. So stay tuned again. I'll be talking with him in segments 2 and 3. It is the last opportunity for you to get my October special report today. The October special report is titled Anatomy of a Recession, Strategies for the Current Economy. And when you go to requestyourreport.com, the website again is requestyourreport.com, I'll be very glad to get you a copy of not only the report, I'll also get you a copy of 2 of my best-selling books, Revenue Sourcing, the Retirement Planning Strategy for the Post-Pandemic Economy. I'll also get you a copy of the Little Black Book on Social Security Maximization. You will get a big box of stuff containing the October 2022 special report, again titled Anatomy of a Recession, Strategies for the Current Economy. And again, go to requestyourreport.com to request all that information. You know, it's been my contention for the last couple of years that stocks and real estate and bonds were all in a bubble. And certainly when you take a look at the price action of the asset classes this year, maybe with the exception of real estate, certainly it's clear that there has been a bubble. So how do bubbles form? Well, bubbles form for many reasons, but the fuel that drives bubbles, the fuel that allows bubbles to form is easy money and easy credit. Now, this is true, as we'll talk about in this segment, when it comes to stocks. It's also true when it comes to real estate. And just take a look at real estate for a moment. At the beginning of the year, interest on a 30-year mortgage was 2.75%. Interest rates now on a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage would be about 7.25%. So you've seen an interest rate increase this year on a 30-year mortgage of about 4.5%. Now, if you're going out and you're buying an average house, if you're buying the median-priced home, you're spending $370,000 or $380,000 today. Let's say you put down a $70,000 or $80,000 down payment and you're financing $300,000. Interest costs at 2.75% compared with interest costs at 7.25% are about $13,500 a year more. So if you're going out to buy that home at the beginning of the year and you're buying that home now, you're going to spend around $1,000 a month more for that home now. Well, the lower the interest rate is, the more affordable the payment is, and because most people buy homes using a mortgage, the lower the interest rate, the higher prices can actually rise. So that's actually what happened, I believe, in the real estate market. I believe that's also what drove stocks a lot higher. Now, some of you may not even be familiar with the fact that you can borrow money to buy stocks. You can borrow money to buy securities. That type of debt, that type of leverage is called margin debt. Now, if you have a non-IRA account, if you have a non-IRA brokerage account in which you're investing in stocks, you can use the stocks in that account as collateral, and you can borrow money pledging those stocks as security for your loan. you need to maintain a 50% equity position in your account. So as stock prices rise, more equity is created, and you can actually borrow more money and buy even more stocks. Now, this has created or helped to create a very big bubble in stocks. As I talked about on my weekly Headline Roundup webinar this past week, according to FINRA, margin debt in the United States exceeded $1 trillion last year. Now, when you look at margin debt, as margin debt bottoms and starts to rise, it often forecasts that the market has bottomed and it's ready to rise. And of course, on the other hand, when margin debt peaks and then falls, it often predicts or forecasts a market decline. Now, when you take a look at the margin debt data that was released last November, it was that and market valuations that made me say in January the market topped in December. Turns out now that's exactly what happened. And now, as stocks are down year to date, we might be looking at margin debt to help us figure out when stocks might bottom. Wolf Richter, one of the commentators that I like to follow, commented on this past week, and he said, based on the current level of margin debt, we are far from any bottom. I would point to the level of margin debt that exists as well as stock valuations using the Buffett indicator to reach that same conclusion. And if you're a new listener and you're not familiar with the Buffett indicator, it simply takes the total value of all stocks and divides by gross domestic product or economic output. And by that measure, stocks are still more overvalued than they were when the tech stock bubble peaked about 20 years ago. Now, margin debt continues to fall. According to Richter, margin debt dropped $24 billion in September from August to $664 billion. Now, that's over $300 billion of margin debt that has been taken out of the market, likely through margin calls. But if you compare margin debt to the 2020 stock market low, it's still 39% above that level. So based on that, we expect that there may be more downside in the market. Now, again, if you are wondering what to do with your money, if you're wondering what to do with your 401k, I'd like to invite you to get my October 2022 special report. Again, it's titled Anatomy of a Recession, Strategies for the Current Economy. The report outlines the current economic situation. It also gives you strategies to consider moving ahead for your individual financial situation that may help you not only survive, but also potentially prosper in what may lie ahead. When you request that report, I'll also send you a copy of 2 of my best-selling books. You'll get a copy of Revenue Sourcing, the Retirement Planning Strategy for the Post-Pandemic Economy. You'll also get a copy of the Little Black Book on Social Security Maximization. To get the report, the 2 books, and some other bonus information, all you need to do is visit the website, requestyourreport.com. Let me know where to mail the box of information. I'll be very glad to do so. Again, the website, requestyourreport.com. I'll be back after these words with my special guest, economist John Williams. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. I have the pleasure once again of interviewing a gentleman. He's a very timely guest, given what the headlines are. John Williams joins us today. His website is Shadow Government Statistics. The web address is shadowstats.com. John tracks economic data using, I'll just say the original methodologies, but I'll let him tell you more about his work momentarily. Hey, John, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Dennis, thank you so much for having me.
So, John, for our listeners, and our audience keeps growing by significantly, actually, tell them a little bit about your work and how you got started doing what you do at shadowstats.com.
Well, I've been an economist for a long time. I studied economics at Dartmouth and econometric modeling. I got into that and at Tuck and got into some unusual economic forecasting. But when I had a family business, imported chainsaws from Germany and sold that. And I was trained as an economist. I had developed my own econometric models on the economy and started selling forecasts where we could forecast based on leading indicators. And that worked pretty well until the government started changing its numbers. And I say changing its numbers, actual redefinitions that in some cases did not have a good motivation behind them. And I found that I really had to look very closely at what they were doing. And I restated the government's numbers the way they used to be and approached people in industry who needed some consistent measures of inflation and such over time, and that gave birth to ShadowStats. I'll give you a very specific example of what happened. The federal government, Congress, was looking at terrible cost of living adjustments back in 1980-81. I think it was double digit. In fact, we just had a headline inflation number of 8.2% year over year in September. Last time you saw anything like that was back in 1981. And at that point in time, what the government did, because this would adjust the cost of living adjustment on Social Security, and I think the headline number on that, something like 8.7%. They use that. They actually use what they call the CPI W, which is a more specific measure of inflation. The CPI-U, which is the one that gets all the headline, but it tends to be a little higher. I figure that should have been about 17%. Had they not made the changes back in, started making the changes back in what was then 1982. And what they did, very simply, was to take key elements and redefine them with a specific goal of reducing the headline consumer price index that would be used to adjust the cost of living adjustment for Social Security. Because if they could do that, that would help them, it would bring down the government's cost and make balancing the budget deficit a little easier. Not that they've balanced the budget deficit, but they occasionally do make an effort at it. And what happened here, first thing they changed was one of the biggest measures in the CPI in terms of weighting, and that's the cost of owning a house. They invented a new concept. So instead of having housing cost, it was redefined as what they call homeowners equivalent rent. What the government did was they modeled what a homeowner would be paying himself to rent renting his own house to himself. And once they had done that, then they calculated the inflation as being how much the homeowner would then raise the rent on himself each month going forward in time. The nonsense number. Once they put the new calculations into effect, I think it had the number I remember seeing at the time was that it knocked 1.5 percentage points off of CPI. But many changes have been made over time, and in terms of changing the concept. And frankly, I take offense at that. I think the government should keep its word to retired people, those on pensions who are living on some kind of an adjustment tied to inflation. But the way the cost of living adjustment had been defined was it was supposed to be a measure of what was needed to maintain a constant standard of living. So the housing thing was just a straight gimmick. Then they went after some basic principles. For example, Alan Greenspan argued that, if the cost of steak goes up, people tend to buy more chicken. That's accurate. That people will do that, but that's not the concept of the cost of living adjustment of the CPI. Maintaining constant standard of living. As far as I'm concerned, having to eat chicken instead of steak is not the same thing. And so what they did was a whole shifting of concepts over time. But the government, very straightforward about what it does. It always will tell you what it's doing, and it also estimated what the different changes that it made to the CPI. It did to the CPI, and almost every change had the effect of reducing the headline CPI. So what I did was I just reverse engineered what they did, and so when they take it out, I'd put it back in and reported what I call the shadow stat CPI, which tends to mimic what the original consumer price index would have been had they not made all the changes.
So, John, let me just jump in there because you had made a comment of 17% earlier in this segment. Is that what you would estimate the actual inflation rate to be using this original inflation calculation methodology?
Yes. In fact, for September, where the government's number was 8.2% year over year, mine was 16.4. Mine hit a peak of 17.3 in the current reporting in June, which is when the government's hit 9.1%. So it's yes, that's where we are right now. And again, that's interestingly what my number is where the cost of living hit. I think it was 1980, which triggered this whole thing. The government. That's when the Congress said, "Hey, we got to bring down the measurement here, the cost of living." And then it was 80. I think it was around 17%, and then it came down pretty close to where we are now, with the headline number, somewhere around 8%. That's when they made the change. That's what triggered them to do it, because those are very expensive cost of living adjustments going forward. And right now, I think it's again, I'm saying don't count on your check being this, but I think it's around 8.7% the cost of living adjustment.
I think that's right for 2023. Yes.
For 2023, that's a significant increase, and it's going to take a bite out of the government's spending, and it's going to widen their budget deficit. That's the same problem they faced 40 years ago. All these numbers you hear it's the highest number since 42 years ago. That's because they reduced the way they calculated inflation after that. But if you look at my number, which was I think it was the 1980 number, it was up around 17%, pretty close to what I've got right now. My number actually is now against the way they reported at a 75-year high. So that's it's just the way they shifted the reporting around, but it was a significant change. It did save them some money. It on the backs of people collecting Social Security, the cost of living adjustment. It was not reasonable. As far as I was concerned, I didn't think it was right. But that's what the government did. And
so, John, let me ask you just quickly. We've got a couple minutes left in this segment. The Fed is now talking tough, but the interest rate increases don't seem to be nearly enough, at least in my view, to get inflation under control. What do you say?
They're doing it completely backwards, and they know it. The Fed has as I view it, the Fed is basically doing what it needs to keep the banking system afloat and solvent. The Federal Reserve is owned by the banking system. The local banks own the regional Federal Reserve banks on up the line. There's a couple of things that are driving the inflation. Number one is the money supply. No question, and that's not coming down. And in fact, there's some extraordinary numbers with that, which I'll get into. You have the supply distortion from the pandemic. That's still affecting things. What's not driving the inflation right now is an overheated economy. If you listen to the Fed, say, "Oh, the economy's so strong, we have to raise interest rates in order to cool it and bring down the inflation." If it was an overheated economy and that was driving the inflation, then raising interest rates would help to reduce the inflation. But that's not what's happening. The economy is moribund, and it's in fact a lot of signs that it's declining again. We had 2 negative quarters, first quarter, second quarter of this year. Looks we've got a third quarter number coming out at the end of this week that probably is going to be on the plus side according to Fed estimates, up around 2%. But the GDP is overstated by about that. But if you look at the employment numbers, payroll employment just recovered its pre-pandemic peak last month. We're well into the pandemic here, but just last month it recovered it by about 100,000 jobs. Where normally you gain 200,000 jobs a month in a standard economy. That 200,000 jobs reflects students coming into the workforce and net of people retiring. Right now, we're about 5 million jobs shy of where we should be. Had we had a normal economy and what the economy should be able to support right now. The economy's not back to normal. It's far shy of where it should be in the employment. It's not an overheating economy that's driving the inflation. Well, the reason the Fed is raising the interest rates is it wants to get interest rates higher. Banks need higher interest rates. They also want to maintain liquidity. They want the liquidity in the system. That's why they're not reducing the money supply. If they were reducing the money supply, they could bring the inflation rate down, but they're not doing that. So things are right now. You're getting a little bit of double talk out of the Fed, but they're not really doing anything to bring the inflation down.
John, I'm going to have to end it there, this segment, where the clock says we're out of time. But the good news is economist John Williams will be joining us again in the next segment. If you'd like to learn more about his work, and I'd encourage you to do that, go to shadowstats.com. John's website is Shadow Government Statistics. The web address is shadowstats.com. I'll return after these words with more with John Williams. This is RLA Radio. I'm Dennis Tubbergen, your host. I am joined today by John Williams. John is an economist. His website is Shadow Government Statistics. I follow his work. I'd encourage you to do the same. Shadowstats.com is the website. So, John, you mentioned in the last segment, and I thought this was interesting, that the Fed increasing interest rates really isn't going to solve the inflation problem because we do not have an economy that is overheating. We have actually the opposite. So, well, let me just ask you a question. Where do you think, what's your forecast, where does inflation ultimately go from here?
Well, it is, it depends to a certain extent on both the Fed and the federal government, because it's not just the Fed that's triggering the inflation. The federal government's continuing to increase its debt. Which is, and its deficit overall, that has been helping to fuel the inflation. I think the inflation is going to get a lot worse. What you've seen if you go back the last couple of months, we had two things happen here. Or let me look at one very, very specific thing. If you look at the headline numbers out of Uncle Sam, headline CPI peaked in June at 9.1. Then that drops to 8.5 July, 8.3 in August, 8.2 in September. So it sounds like it's coming down. Not so. The reason that dropped was that the president ordered some release of petroleum reserves, which reduced gasoline prices, and you want to get a quick shift in the aggregate CPI, make a major shift in gasoline prices, and that will do it, and that's what we saw here. So what happened with the drop in gasoline prices is that the third quarter inflation was lower. Well, of course, the third quarter inflation is the same one that's used for the cost of living adjustments next year. So I'm not saying they were manipulating the CPI like the government did back in the early 80s, but it looks like maybe there were some changes made here that helps lower it. I think you're going to see that bouncing back up in the quarter ahead. They can't keep reducing the petroleum reserves. And without the Fed taking meaningful action here to reduce it, I think you're going to get up to 10%, probably in the by the end of the year over year CPI, and very easily accelerating beyond that. Gets to a point where you start to see some talk of hyperinflation. That's a risk. I can't tell you for sure it's going to happen, but it's the type of thing that I think is a real risk. And given the way the Fed is handling the economy right now, you could have we're certainly in a we're in an inflationary economic downturn, depression, and it could become a hyperinflationary downturn or depression. And the type of thing that can save you there, what I would look at, is holding physical gold and silver. Now, I know gold and silver prices are depressed right now amazingly against the inflation picture. I mean, I'm highly suspect of what's happening there. I have a high degree of confidence that somebody's playing games with the precious metals to try and encourage investment elsewhere. The Fed, the federal government, never like to see high gold prices because they're not doing their job. But when you get inflation like this is not inflation that's going to go away. It's going to get worse. You have the long-term inflation hedge shelter of the physical precious metals, and I would look to physically hold coins and silver coins and gold coins from the standpoint that if we get into a hyperinflation, which I believe is a risk, you may be using those to barter for goods.
So John, if I can interrupt, you say hyperinflation and depression. Those are both very scary terms to our listeners. What would you say, if you were to handicap this, what's the probability of such an outcome in your view? Is it highly probable? Is it an outside possibility? What does John Williams think the probability is?
Well, it obviously depends on things how things break here, but as things stand right now, I put it about 40% for a depression-like economic downturn, and in terms of accompanying inflation, I'd look for the inflation to be higher than you'd expect in that type of circumstance, and in the 30% range for hyperinflation.
Wow. So this is not a small possibility. John, do you see that ultimately this hyperinflation will be a worldwide phenomenon, and how do you think it affects currencies?
Well, it's given the way people are handling their economies and money supplies right now, there's a fair shot of that going global. But the U.S. is probably the greatest risk here in terms of its overall impact on the global economy and the way the government and the Fed seem to be handling things. I'd watch the U.S. and if you again the hedge I would look at there is physical precious metals, and I think that's one reason they're being depressed. And if you get into hyper circumstance, if you get into a point where you actually need to, we have a currency that collapses, and there have been examples of that. Nothing of the scope of the United States in modern years, but you look at Zimbabwe or even Weimar Republic. That's I guess almost a century ago, but you look at how people survived it, and it was basically that's through hard assets and not hanging onto their depreciating cash much.
So, John, in the time we have left, what, in your view, is the relationship between an ongoing federal budget deficit and hyperinflation? To what extent do these big deficits contribute to hyperinflation potentially?
Well, the bigger the worse. They're not hyperinflationary yet, but again, you're looking at the inflation becomes self-feeding, and that's again, look what happened 42 years ago. There's 17% inflation. They redefined inflation. You still have that inflation there. I mean, that's why where my numbers are. I mean, if you look at my inflation numbers, they're not hyperinflationary, but they're a lot closer. And people would be thinking of it as being a lot closer if they saw those numbers. You get up towards 20%, and people are going to be worrying about it. And I think we have a chance of seeing that headline in the next year or so.
Wow, that is scary. That is scary. So, John, when it comes to looking at the role that precious metals have played in past inflationary or hyperinflationary environments, can you talk a little bit? Will metals help people maintain their purchasing power? Do they gain in purchasing power? Historically, how have metals performed?
It preserves the purchasing power. And let me tell you, I mean, I've been learning this process as well, and I've been learning some from my own numbers. What I did with my alternate CPI measure that calculates the CPI the way it was before the government changed it in 1982. And let me say that was when there's a big change in the CPI. Before that was fairly consistent. I think it was a fair CPI estimate before they started changing it. And so what I did in estimating what it would be had they not made the changes, and you've given you the current numbers on it, I thought I would. I'd look at plots of year-to-year change and things like that in comparison. But what I did was, let's just plot the price of gold against my index and against the consumer price index. Well, my index and the consumer price index are the same before 1982. Mine is the CPI, but just restated for what happened in the the changes after 1982 and after. So when I plotted them together, I was shocked. I didn't have to change the scale. Pure coincidence, but you have. If you look at the current headline CPI, they had the base year used to just have a single base year. Now I think it's 1982, 1984 equals 100 average there. My index and the government's index are on the same basis. So you go back before where it's 100, and where we've got the same numbers going back in time. You go back to 1971 when Nixon floated the dollar, and the price indices are average around 79 at that point. Price of gold averaged about 79 then too. So the price is just pure coincidence. So plotting them going forward, what I found was that when you get past 1982, gold follows my index, not the government's. The government's just sort of falls off. Mine goes almost exponential. Now, it's not perfect, but I'll be posting this in the next week or two that shows the plot. It's very close over time. Sometimes the gold leads. Usually, the gold leads my index, but there's also an overlap, and they're roughly the same order of magnitude. Based on my price index, gold should have been over $2,000 at the end of last year. We're not there now, but we'll see where it goes. But over time, gold and the inflation have held together, so it preserves a purchasing power. You can but it's done this over the millennia. I mean, you can if you buy a loaf of bread in ancient Rome and a loaf of bread here today, you do the same. Use the same amount of gold. It's a store of wealth, and you get into a hyperinflation, bad inflation circumstance. The store of wealth is a good thing to have.
Well, John, the clock says we're going to have to leave it there. My guest today has been Mr. John Williams. Check out his website at shadowstats.com. John, always a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for joining us and giving us an update. We'd love to have you back down the road.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate your having me, and I'll be happy to be with you anytime.
Appreciate that, as do the listeners. We will return after these words. You are listening to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen, and thanks again to economist John Williams for joining us on today's program. If you're just tuning in, I am offering the October 2022 special report for the last time today. The report is titled Anatomy of a Recession, Strategies for the Current Economy. When you request that report, I will be glad to also send you a copy of 2 of my best-selling books. You'll get a copy of Revenue Sourcing, the Retirement Planning Strategy for the Post-Pandemic Economy. You'll also get a copy of my book, The Little Black Book on Social Security Maximization. If you go to the website, requestyourreport.com, and let me know where to mail this information, I'll be very glad to do so. The website again, requestyourreport.com. You know, it has been my view that the U.S. has been in recession since the first of the year, and while there are those that might disagree with that, we did have economic contraction for the first 2 quarters of the year, meeting what has always been the technical definition of a recession. Now, when you take a look at one thing that's not often talked about, but I think it should be the one thing that is most often talked about, that is debt levels. And when you look at debt levels in the economy today, of course, there's government debt. U.S. government debt now has surpassed $31 trillion for the first time in history. Deficits are still sky high. And that certainly is a factor, I believe, in the inflation that we're seeing. But when you take a look at debt levels that exist in the private sector today, and I talk about this in the October special report, Anatomy of a Recession, we have private sector debt that when measured as a percentage of the economy rivals levels that existed in 1929 at the beginning of the Great Depression. At the end of calendar year 2020, private sector debt was 235% of economic output or gross domestic product. Now that is an unsettling statistic. However, there's another layer to this proverbial onion. The US dollar, the currency in which economic output is measured, as you all know, is a mere shadow of its former self. Now, I've often used this example to make the point, so forgive me if you've heard it before, and I will try to be expeditious in the explanation. In 1971, then-President Nixon eliminated the link between the U.S. dollar and gold. Prior to that date, the U.S. dollar was backed by gold. It was exchangeable for gold at the rate of $35 an ounce. Now let's go back to 1971. The price of a new home in 1971 was about $25,000. If you had $25,000 in cash, you could buy a new house. If you had 700 ounces of gold, you could also buy a new house. Now, as I talked about in the first segment, the average price of a new home today is about $380,000. And the $25,000 that would have purchased that entire home in 1971 is now not even a down payment on that average home. But the 700 ounces of gold that would have bought one home in 1971 would today buy nearly 4 average homes. Here's the point. In U.S. dollars, the price of a home has appreciated considerably. Priced in gold, the price of a home has declined appreciably. So the metric or the measuring stick used to measure prices establishes perspective. Now, I bring this up to make the point that all economic data today is measured in U.S. dollars. So if I use that house factor, a home has appreciated by a factor of 15-fold due to U.S. dollar devaluation. So since U.S. economic output is also measured in dollars, wouldn't it be reasonable to make the same assumption when measuring economic output? In 1971, GDP, or gross domestic output, was $1.65 trillion. If we increase that number by 15, we get $24.75 trillion. Based on our real estate example, perhaps that is our inflation-adjusted GDP number. The actual GDP, $22.99 trillion in 2021. The economy has actually contracted since 1971 when measured in gold. So the metric, the measuring stick used, makes all the difference. I talk about this in the October 22 special report and give you some strategies to consider for your own personal situation. Again, the special report is titled Anatomy of a Recession, Strategies for the Current Economy. Let me know where to mail that and the 2 best-selling books, and I'll be very glad to do so. The website is requestyourreport.com. The website, once again, to get all that information is requestyourreport.com. That's my program for this week. Hope you got something you can use. I'll be back again next week.